Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And on this episode, I wanted to talk about that they could have done that better feeling. Last weekend, I decided to see two new movies. Well, one new-ish. The latter came out the weekend before last. I decided to see two new movies, Backrooms and Tuner, and while one of these productions earned considerably more of my favor than the other, both of them definitely inspired that very familiar feeling. You know, just that moment where you can't help but itch and chafe at what is otherwise an at least decently interesting premise for just a run-of-the-mill genre film, one horror, one crime thriller, and in a few false turns drives it into a big obstacle. Maybe not a brick wall or even one of those, like, two guys carrying a plate glass across the road, but certainly a fruit stand. Can we say it's a fruit stand when there's just a point in a movie where you just go, we're not stopped. I don't resent any of this. But the back tire you made just a few scenes ago is just thumping and juggling us, and so whatever else you do good, whatever nice scenery we saw along the way, bro, you drove right into that fruit stand, and we're still feeling it as we're going along. Starting us off, Backrooms is the latest boutique horror flick from vaunted indie film financier, producer, and distributor A24. It stars Chiwetel Ejiofor as Clark, a divorced alcoholic owner of a failing furniture outlet, and Renata Reinsva as Dr. Mary Klein, Clark's therapist, herself struggling with a monotony and malaise in her own life, still carrying the core wound of her traumatic experiences being raised in early childhood by her mother, portrayed in flashback by Krista Kosonen, with what turns out to be a small but standout performance among the cast as she, it's revealed, deteriorated into some kind of paranoid schizophrenic psychosis. On the Clark side of things, having taken to spending his nights drinking himself to sleep watching TV in his warehouse, he eventually discovers a mysterious metaphysical door in the walls of his basement that leads to the cryptical parallel world of the title, the Backrooms. It's a seemingly infinite liminal time space that at first takes the form of some kind of massive, banal, fluorescent-lit office-like series of rooms and halls, but which, as explored, reveals increasingly elaborate, uncanny, anomalous features and objects, forced perspectives, odd angles, seemingly functionless interior design choices. Quite frankly, the sets for this movie are phenomenal. But as Clark further explores the Backrooms, it frankly looks, to me at least, a lot less like what I see a lot of current reactions to it describing it as, a video game. I just look at it and see a rather kind of fantastic conceptual installation piece. But, of course, no conceptual installation piece in the world, no matter how large or advanced, could break the laws of basic physics. Nor would it be so fascinating and fun if there were boogeymen down there. Well, the Backrooms can, and there are. It is while fleeing one of these first encountered, as yet obscured spectral entities that Clark is able to find his way back to the door that brought him here by crawling through a very Alice in Wonderland styled door that brings him back around to the first room where he started in a kind of impossible loop. But that's the kind of cognitive dissonance that proves to be a very hard contradiction to resolve compellingly in Backrooms as it goes on as not just a series of set pieces going deeper and deeper into this liminal space, but as this two-track parallel narrative between Clark and Klein, one apparently quitting the brown stuff, eager to show the other not just his personal breakthrough, but to show her the proof of what he's discovered. Because in spite of all the danger, Clark has found a new lease on life, or at least an obsession, and I kinda see where the dude is coming from. That place looks really cool, but for the boogeyman thing, but that's what kind of ends up being the yoke this production's got around its neck. The Backrooms, the space, the sets themselves are kind of just so implicitly conceptual, so implicitly attractive as an installation. You can't help but kind of just share at least a little bit in exactly Clark's feeling. This is a pretty cool place to just go spelunking and walk around in. It's like a controlled risk playground for grown-ups. But whereas some movies are never as well directed as they are written, some are never as well shot as they are acted, and some you can kind of just toss away and keep the soundtrack or the score. Backrooms is never good enough for the Backrooms. The set is the best part, and it really wasn't long before that familiar "you could have done that better" feeling crept into the equation of my experience of this for me, so that by the end of it, I wasn't thinking, well, at least I got to spend a decent amount of time in a neat conceptual world exploring it by proxy. I was thinking, you could literally just put a Steadicam through this whole set silently, slowly, for 2 hours, recording everything, and I would be hooked from second one until second last. Backrooms is directed by one Kane Parsons, based on a found-footage sci-fi horror web series he had begun in 2022, releasing 24 more episodes over the course of 3 years. That web series itself was inspired by and directly named after a creepypasta, and if you're like me and you're old enough that you've heard that word before and have sort of an idea of what it is, but you just kind of do the old man thing of, I don't need to know what these kids are talking about. A creepypasta is basically a decentralized community of online horror storytelling and content creation, where all sorts of people take inspiration from the same original post, usually something that is banal, but features some uncanny quality to its convergent audience, and then they riff on that in the form of both original e-literature, indie video games, and of course, web series. Though Parsons' series turned out to be such a big online sensation, lots of people don't even know that he didn't completely originate the concept, but his web series handily buoyed to the top, and based on its viral success, he was approached by several studios before settling on developing a feature-length film prequel to that first webisode with A24. Parsons was only 17 when he began releasing the original Backrooms web series, producing the first installment entirely through an open-source digital effects and composition software called Blender. He was even neglecting his early filmmaking education at the Martin School of Arts in Nevada, California, a clear savant and prodigy, at least on the conceptual side of things. But it's nonetheless still uncanny and, in my own opinion, still a little f***ed up that even as production and distribution companies inevitably train their gaze on the potentially lucrative market of crossovers between online and theatrical film content, this movie is doing absolute gangbusters off of its core demographic of early millennial to late Zoomer fans especially. It's still a little f***ed up that I'm talking about a blockbuster indie film juggernaut that was basically achieved by scouting a kid out of high school like he was a prospective college athlete and not, a kid. I mean, they may have waited until Parsons finished up his studies before heading into principal photography, but at the end of the day, Parsons' position is not all that different from a lot of those stars of the college athletic circuit themselves, which is that for whatever inevitable cultivation of his career might have come from this, the perverse incentives of making money off of their nascent talents carry severe risks of not just his not being able to branch out in terms of his personal and social exploration without there needing to be a transaction as a factor, no check, no content share, no attention economy, just life and meeting and collaborating with other creatives organically who are all just doing it for the love of the game and the love of learning about their craft as they go along as well. I also hope that I don't have to stress too hard in a macro sense that the elevation of Parsons by A24 A24 as basically the latest name that they've broken to the theatrical mainstream, an all-star whose jersey will be hung from the rafters next to new film school nerd icons of boutique horror and fantasy like Robert Eggers and Ari Aster. If you buy that posture from A24 that this is some kind of unmitigated success story that we all need to just get behind and stop hating on success, I'm either going to assume that you're about as young or younger than Parsons and thus just as endemically immature, or that if you're my age, you're one of those cretins who actually reads those Horatio Algiers headlines of like, 11-year-old girl pays for mom's chemo treatments with lemonade stand, and doesn't immediately want to crash your face through glass of the utterly cruel joke that it is living in the microwaving shithole country that this is right now. If you're one of these jackanapes who takes any criticism of Backrooms as immature or underdeveloped, like it's some kind of personal barb against Kane Parsons, and if you are my age or older while doing it, I'm going to just have to stand back and tell you, and not Kane Parsons, grow the up. First of all, Backrooms isn't even written by Parsons. I know, shocker, turns out this kid may have been a technical savant and built out the world of this concept, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's exceptional enough in all facets to suddenly turn around a feature-length screenplay. Those honors went to Will Sudik, an established TV writer, so when I'm talking about maturity of craft, let's be clear, I'm not talking about Parsons. I'm talking about the entire culture of fully formed adults around him betraying their own immaturity, whether it's because of blinkered cynicism or just dopey sentimentality. Through their capitalizing upon Parsons' talents rather than really contributing to their challenging and development, again, without there needing to be some perverse profit incentive. That perverse profit incentive is also, let's be real, just holding up Parsons as a stalking horse for a much wider commercial agenda, to not only whittle down the size of necessary personnel in the production of even small movies like this produced for just $10 million, but to further justify that all of those prospective artists who will inevitably fall through the cracks of this very real, all-consuming realm of decaying edifices and predatory boogeymen that they're dealing with right now, that will be negligible compared to the maximal financial potential of treating the arts more like professional sports, of scouting online viral sensations for the youngest, freshest talent to break, and projecting a reactionary image of successful art as somehow being tied to great, especially white men or boys of history, to these once-in-a-lifetime visionaries, as opposed to the value of art itself being in that very cultivation of a freedom of exploration and constant learning, not only about oneself, but through others of like mind at shared stages of creative development. Hollywood is all about auteurs right now, not about crews, not about teams, not about young people with a shared experience coming together on shared necessities to challenge the hegemony in the relationship between capital and their labor. It is not enough to view Backrooms from a merely banal commercial film perspective. Whether one really considers it some kind of new high watermark in boutique, middle-brow, art house genre crossover horror cycle, or basically a wash of hackneyed premises and cliches. You have to consider it as basically the most expensive student film ever made, just one in which all of that, again, endemically underdeveloped and immature craft making is completely removed from an environment where young people can be challenged for critical reasons, while also, I don't know, making really good friends and collaborators with actors, editors, composers, writer, VFXers your own age, and even just hipster artist friends who can open your mind and make you realize, oh, there is a whole world of creative stuff that I could potentially expand my talents and learning into. I don't have to just make movies or even audio-visual media. I can do whatever I want. As opposed to you just being the one guy, and I'm sorry, and I'm sure a lot of film school educators would agree, there already is a big one one guy problem in film schools already. You frankly have to do a lot of work to unteach a lot of kids, especially affluent white boys, the idea that what you're learning is how to be the new A24 star athlete. No, this is an art training. We're going to really test you not just about what you already know you love, but what you don't even know you can love yet. When I say that the primary tones that Backrooms projects is shallow confidence and immaturity, that is because it is endemically a shallow and immature enterprise, with the burden not falling upon Parsons as a director, but upon A24 and a hack script by Sudik. This movie starts off with a whole vibe of, they could have done that better, because even though it is not a found footage film, yes, it does feature extensive found footage sequences, and yes, they are the most boring and uninspired parts of the film. Typical, come on, we gotta go, what is that? Speed running of set pieces being chased by interchangeable boogeymen. But the first scene of this thing is even a found footage cold open that shows the insignia of some shady research conglomerate. It's set in 1990, so yay, another retro horror. Wouldn't want this kid who's barely 21 to be making something more, I don't know, germane to the world that he lives in, not just a facsimile of non-iconic artifacts of previous decades absorbed through screen life. And yeah, some guy in protective gear with an old camcorder is chased down by some unseen monster or whatever, and it's like, great, well, now I know about the Backrooms and that some shady Wayland-Yutani style corporation is involved. Kind of counterintuitive for a narrative that is, you know, going to pretty critically depend upon Ejiofor as an interlocutor, discovering and exploring this setting and learning incrementally about it. I know cold opens like this are pretty routine for horror films, but you can only say that especially for the ones that often feel the most boringly derivative, because they basically tell us what the story is going to be before they even try to tell us the story. And in this case, that cripples our ability to really share in some sense of Clark's own awe and fear, and then inspiration when he basically dives headfirst into the Backrooms. It's not foreshadowing, it's just a cheap hook you gimmick that doesn't work because it's doubling down on the exact sorts of features of the first webisode that Parsons made that were its least interesting facet, its most derivative facet, the found footage conceit, and the emphasis on just vague spectral entities and jump scares rather than the environment and the strange, evocative, uncanny feelings it inspires the longer you just stay in it. But it's not long before we pivot into our official introduction to Clark and Klein in media res in a counseling visit. Clark expresses his sad, bitter conviction that he just hurts people that get close to him and that he'd probably be better off protecting others by isolating himself. And Klein guides him through a kind of combination regression hypnosis and improv acting exercise where she plays his wife, and I don't mean she just role plays what his wife would say, but she emotes with conviction to him, like she's literally trying to empathetically portray his wife, inhabit her. And they apparently replay the night that suggestively served as the final straw instigating Clark's divorce. He showed up back home drunk late at night after just sad sacking at his failing store. She starts challenging him on why he keeps lying, why he isn't doing better, why he shows her so little respect and even contempt. And Clark just explodes into a verbally abusive, misogynistic tirade at Klein as if she is his wife. And Klein doesn't just act hurt. Reinsve portrays it as if she really internalizes and takes personally what Clark is doing, his verbal abuse of her. The writing is on the wall from the get-go. Clark is, however vulnerable he might make himself on the surface, he is a narcissist. And that's where I really start to go, you could have done that better, Why is a narcissist even in therapy? I know that among certain online poison sectors of Parsons' generation, and apparently Sudik is dematured enough by the internet to find it compelling, that there is this paranoia about the idea that certain toxic people could use the superficial language of mental health, the performance of going to therapy at all, as a strategy to manipulate and pull people in rather than truly work on themselves. This is, again, where I say to people my age and older who are just as immature as those Zoomers who buy into that sort of mimetic fear, you need to grow the up. Very typically, narcissists don't or wouldn't go to therapy willingly unless forced to, because, get this, they're narcissists. And even when they do go to therapy, they very rarely stick it out because at a certain point, a therapist that's qualified or, not highly paid by a small minority of very wealthy people, that's that perverse incentive coming up again, they are going to challenge their patient, and that narcissist is going to say, "See ya," because they're narcissists. A big part of the pathology of a narcissistic individual is that so much of your sense of self-worth comes not only from a grandiose expectation about how others should perceive you, but from demeaning others in order to preserve that sense of grandiosity at any cost. Therapy might get you attention from one individual, that much desired sympathy and reassurance, especially if you see a vulnerable narcissist like Clark is being portrayed here. But narcissists are inevitably more likely to perceive even needing therapy as a stigma against you, against themselves, like you're weak or stupid if you need a therapist. Clark is far more likely in certain interpersonal relationships, like with, say, an employee or a spouse, the actual spouse, not just someone portraying her who he needs to keep in his real, genuine, personal, parasitic control. That same person is far more likely to see the entire culture of mental health we have now and say, so many of these kids with depression and anxiety, they really just need some tough love, or even, those are just weak, dumb people, they're hopeless. Especially in the period when this film takes place, and before you even try with the, well, he could have been compelled to go to therapy as part of some civil settlement. No, because unfortunately, while Sudik's script is in tatters at a character level before we even get out of the gate, or go through the gate, Parsons is still a prodigy. He's still a really good director when it comes to his visual intuition. Sudik deserves at least some credit for giving Parsons this room, but it's the latter who shows a pretty decent facility for being able to tell the dramatic character elements of his film through primarily visual and not directly stated expository means. Parsons is consistently going for more rather than less, depending on the inferences his audience can make, as is the case with the omnipresence of the analog TV. It's not just a banal curio or artifact that has this exciting, superficial hold on Zoomer audiences who develop uncritical obsessions with the shapes and features and textures of retro technology. It helps tell the story in understated ways that you can infer from. Clark spends his nights slowly drinking himself into poverty or death in front of a TV, and during one of Klein's typical lonely, malaise-ridden slices of life, we see her also sitting up late at night with a TV dinner watching infomercials, including one for her own book, which turns out to be some pretty shabby-looking self-help garbage. Clark found out about Klein from the television. He wasn't forced by law, he went willingly. Which, again, is a stone against the depth and maturity of Sudik as a writer, not against Parsons, who, while a savant when it comes to his visual craft, is literally too young to know how fatuous and stupid this whole scenario comes off on its surface. A positive view of mental health care in popular culture, at least to the level that we have now, it was not even close to being in the mainstream in the time that the film is set, not nearly so much as when Parsons came of age. Before that, it wouldn't have been just narcissists like Clark who viewed not just therapy, but the specific kind of therapy that it's revealed Klein really offers. This completely balderdash, unscientific TV infomercial self-help garbage. It would have been most people who looked at that with not just suspicion, but derision, with stigma. If I could translate it for my younger viewers, Clark would have thought that infomercial was so fucking cringe. He would not have found something in this hippy-dippy quack's wares that was worth taking seriously. He would have laughed at it before drunkenly turning over in his used bed saying, "Well, at least I'm not that dumb." A character like Clark, with the track record of intimate partner abuse coming out of that situation in the era that he was in, he wouldn't have even gotten far enough into the door to even admit that he was capable of wrongdoing, of hurting people. That's what he does in this opening scene. It's one of the first lines out of his mouth, and even vulnerable narcissists usually have to be treated until they can accept accountability for how they treat people and its effects on their lives, rather than just making it everybody else's problem. And, more importantly, honestly, on Dr. Klein's side of this equation, yes, history is filled with quacks and cynics just trying to make a fast buck, and sometimes when you really look into their background, you find it very easy to believe that they don't even know it sometimes. They're just lost in their own backrooms, as it were. But the whole thing is that the way those quacks usually come to where they are, how they choose to make money, it's usually because it's them who's far more likely to be the narcissist. Klein is far more likely in this scenario to be the one who is exploiting and milking off a guy like Clark, who, unless we frame it within the degenerative feedback loop of some dematuring social media leads us to this flattened caricature of a toxic person, is not really any kind of narcissist. He doesn't have any special PD. He's just kind of a schmuck, a disappointed schmuck who didn't get the success story life and trophy wife he wanted and is really not having a good time about it. In other words, basically he's a man. Basically, he's a man under patriarchy. But needless to say, that would be the far more intuitive, to me at least, paradigm in a sort of relationship like this, even if we change nothing else, that it's Klein who is the monster, and Clark who is her mark. Her vehicle for not just money, but also validation at a deep cerebral core of herself. But it's not just the anachronism of that motivation in these two characters that's hurting things. It's the realization of it in that drawn-out scene. We could all take it for granted that Klein has just joined the annals of some of the worst therapists in horror movie history, of which there are many, but effectively the dramatic cornerstone of this parallel drama that blends elements of both psychological and supernatural horror in addition to found footage, it becomes the relationship between a vulnerable narcissistic patient who has successfully used the implied threat of taking his own life to ensnare the sympathies of a superficially accomplished and credentialed but ultimately morose and passive woman who is desperate to redeem him from this fate because she's trying to recreate the traumatic circumstances of her mother's own mental decline, relive her trauma symbolically so she can try to overcome it, fix it this time. That basically what they have is a kink relationship. She plays his ex-wife. She tries to treat him by making him roleplay the most triggering, aggressive episode of his life, the one that brought him to her, and then just absorb whatever violent epithets and degrading language he throws at her. It's not just that for a typical genre movie, it could just be considered shallow and fatuous and immature in its construction. Reflective both of Sudik's own completely superficial relationship to the psychology of his characters, as well as the norms of the time he and Parsons have set this feature-length prequel in. It's that it's like just grossly misogynist. And of course, the person in this scenario who would be the most likely to be the human monster in disguise, because she is actually far more accomplished and successful and self-sufficient than Clark is, because she's a woman, she's just slotted into the role as the passive recipient of abuse, and that she's even basically asking for it in a weird subconscious way. It's really fucked up, and extra fucked up when you do, again, remember that this is a movie being directed by a guy who is not even old enough to drink. I don't even care if Parsons maybe has some traumatic personal familiarity with some of the content that went into guiding Sudik's writing here, because my dude is not old enough to relate to the period in which he set this film, nor was he given the adequate tools to really buckle down and do what a film school teacher would tell you to do with a period setting. Research, not just the superficial, banal visual content. I don't care how interestingly you can rearrange and present it, because then all you're going to be left with is an impressive set and a shallow, fatuous story. At the very least, I can't help but conclude that Parsons is not worldly or experienced enough to tell the difference between a genuinely compelling exploration of the often fraught relationships that can emerge between a therapist and a patient when one or both of them are masking some truly disturbed incentives for maintaining their relationship, whether for just cynical reasons or something more terrifyingly grandiose. But he's not mature enough to be able to tell the difference between that and just some fopped off pseudo-psychological nonsense that is instantly going to compromise his big name-breaking debut feature, because going along with that dumb found footage horror cold open, it's just the absolutely least original, most hackneyed thing that a boutique horror movie under the A24 banner of all things could do, which is try to tie the significance of the fantastical elements of the story to some core wound of the character, some tortured metaphor to go with that metaphysical landscape. And the point remains the same, that the idea that A24 is projecting with this release, that postures of psychological or social depth is what elevates an otherwise routine horror flick, when push comes to shove, the treatment of the Backrooms as a source of spectacle isn't really any different from, like, the Nether in Insidious. A24, I have 4 words for you. Grow the f*** up. It is not the artsy depth of a genre work that elevates its horrific tropes, its patterns and expectations, its familiar forms and entities that attract people not for an intellectual, but rather for intuitive reasons, for pure experiential attraction to the idea of revisiting and internalizing those concepts of the bizarre and shocking and uncanny again and again and again. It is the exceptional or novel demonstration of those qualities as a foundation. It is the skilled execution of that which plays on just the intuitive joy of something like Parsons' whole concept for the Backrooms as just a space, as just a setting, as just a scenario. That is what is supposed to elevate the depth of a work itself. It would be one thing if Backrooms was a purely surrealist or magical realist film, but it's not even close. Nothing surreal happens in the whole picture. It's all just Parsons doing his job and quite impressively being able to tell us the story mostly through showing, through inferences in editing and simple visual metaphors in cinematography. But even in the deepest catacombs of the Backrooms itself, there is no imagery or sequence so abstract that it lacks a consistent formulaic expectation. If we have to have this film, it should have been Sudik and A24 who did a better job of making sure that just this regular low-budget sci-fi horror film works at least as well as, like, Primate. But that monkey movie, for all of its flaws, instantly clears the deck when you have to put it up against this story about the world's most pathetic narcissist and his degradation kink relationship with the the world's worst therapist. And slap on top of that a boring score that, even when Clark first just discovers the Backrooms, instantly leaves nothing to the imagination by just adopting the patterns of another played out, dark ambient drone for its musical scoring, so that there's not even a crevice of nuanced sensation or feeling to hide in. And with all of those compounding, you could have done that better, you could have done that better, you shouldn't have done that at all, that makes no fucking sense moments, you just realize that the Backrooms is doing the most cynical thing imaginable, using the shallow confidence and immature pose of someone who really wants to try something different, really blow people's expectations, really tell a deep and character-focused drama, and not just a regular horror movie. You realize that all of that is just a put-on for how fucking boring and unexceptional it increasingly becomes. When it's a boutique psychological horror, it's boring and derivative. When it's a conventional supernatural horror movie, it's boring and derivative. When it's a found footage horror movie, Jesus Christ, claw my fucking eyes out. That's the cognitive dissonance that Backrooms can't resolve. It's a movie that is convinced with every fiber of its being that it needs to justify the Backrooms, even though the Backrooms are the only interesting thing about it, and it's everything else that is dragging it all the fuck down. I said it up top, and I'll say it again, I would literally have preferred just watching a long, steady shot of the Backrooms for 2 hours. I really would have. Just that said is the only good thing about this movie, which is why this glorified student film out of the Hollywood School of Disappearing Arts gets a 2 out of 5. That 2 is for Kane, though, and his brilliant, beautiful set. That is really cool, dude. Please build it so that we can all go to the Backrooms together. Leave out the boogeymen. I mean, we'll already be the boogeymen. If you actually build the Backrooms, I imagine you're gonna get a lot of those types real quick in there. With that, I'm getting the out of here. Stay tuned for Tuner. Not as dire as Backrooms, but Anyway, thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right, what did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary! I'm gonna catch you guys next time.